Denver Broncos rookie wide receiver Pat Bryant will emerge as Bo Nix's go-to target behind Courtland Sutton. We'll tell you how that's going to be possible on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Friday, Broncos Country. Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you know it is your team every day for all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more every single day, all year long. Locked On Broncos is the place to be. A special shout out to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to tune in, making us your first listen, however you choose to do so. And don't miss out on your favorite Broncos coverage by becoming an everyday. Hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team. As always, I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports. Sayre will rejoin me next week as we get ready to break down OTAs and minicamp, which is coming up. But Broncos Country, we got a jam-packed episode for you here today following the 2025 NFL schedule release. We recap that. If you missed that, make sure you go check it out wherever you get your podcast. But on today's show, we're going to go through takes on takes. Broncos Country sent in their takes, and one of the ones sent in, Pat Bryant will emerge as the go-to option for Bo Nix behind Courtland Sutton. There could be a very big volume chance that we see that happen here this upcoming season. The Broncos will become road warriors and knock off both teams that were in the Super Bowl on the road this upcoming season. That was another one sent in by an avid member in Broncos Country. And then we'll go over some of the roster moves that the Broncos made. They released 4 players. They signed 4 players. They placed a designation exempt tag on a player that they had drafted that will not count against their roster. You're going to get all that reaction and much more here on today's episode of the show. So let's kick things off here. Open it up with takes on takes. Ask Broncos Country, following the NFL schedule release, following the NFL draft, send me your takes and I'll respond to them. I'll give my take on your take here. Our first one's going to come in from Lou. Lou says, Pat Bryant becomes Bo Nix's go-to target on offense after Courtland Sutton. Now, I don't think that's necessarily like a bold, crazy take. I think that's a very valid take. I think it's something that has some legs to it that we could see, and I'm going to dive into why I believe that to be possible. And I already know some people are going to say, well, what about Marvin Mims? What about Troy Franklin? What about Devon Vele? Those guys all factor in the equation, but I think that there is a chance that Bryant could become a go-to guy here for Bo Nix outside of Courtland Sutton, right? So what Lou is essentially saying here is Courtland's going to be the top volume getter here for Bo. He's obviously his number one guy, his go-to guy on third down. But now I think that there's going to be chances for Pat Bryant to maybe take some of that load off. And look, not saying I'm going to place that expectation on the rookie to go out there and say, all right, hey, Courtland's the number one guy. But when it comes to volume targets on third down, you're going to be the next guy because we need you to do that. I think a skill set trait that stands out to me about Pat Bryant, I think will make this feasible. And I think the number one thing the Broncos wide receiver room has to have to it, and Sean Payton has, and the coaching staff, they have to kind of create this expectation. There has to be established roles at wide receiver, right? And look, I'm as guilty of this myself as everybody else. I think we get too much in the habit of saying, okay, wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2. To be honest with you, that's more of a fantasy football term than anything. I think when we try to say that, it's like, okay, who's the number 2 option at wide receiver, right? That's probably the more feasible thing to say than wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, so on and so forth. Pat Bryant doesn't need to be a wide receiver 2, 3, 4, or 5. He just needs to be a wide receiver. Now, Courtland on third down, as we know, his big body, that's something that Courtland and Bo, they like that advantage because Courtland, for his size at 6'4", is explosive. He's a big body guy. He loves that back shoulder throw where he can adjust and catch it against smaller defenders. And he's also a guy that can hurt a defense on in-breaking routes. So I would say we see Courtland more vertical and more to the outside and more staggered. I'd say more so than we see him on those deep over routes that maybe we saw early on in his career. I think that's design of the offense. I think it's just situations. But I would love to see that game open up a little bit more from Courtland Sutton. So this is why I agree with Lou. I think Pat Bryant can emerge as Bo Nix's second go-to guy in situations like this. It could be on first down. It could be on third down, right? Because if it's third down and Courtland's getting attention from defenses, Here's where Pat Bryant can eat. Those in-breaking routes. Now, I don't know if any of you, if you've had the chance to go watch some of the film breakdowns I've done on Pat Bryant, or you've been able to watch Pat Bryant's tape yourself, the one thing that you'll see is that he is great as an in-breaking route runner. I think he's great as an out-breaking route runner. Like, he's a guy that, while he doesn't necessarily have the top speed vertically, that's not an issue. That's not a problem. That ain't no problem. But what he could do is he'll plant that outside foot on an in-breaking route. He'll showcase it if he's running vertical. He'll get the DB to commit, and he creates separation because he is explosive in the short to intermediate game there. Great route runner inside, great route runner on the out-breaking routes. That's where I think he can add value here to the Broncos and become a go-to option here. Now, this doesn't take anything away from Marvin Mims, right? I think that we're just trying to figure out what is this offense going to look like in totality. I feel like there was so much, to question about the wide receiver room last year. Like, you're trying to get guys to fit into these roles, but that takes time. Well, if Devon Vele has an established role, right, and he's going to come in and do X, and X, that's fine, great. Troy Franklin, we know, is that bigger guy, 6'2", but he's got Marvin Mims-like speed. You might get him on more of those in-breaking routes, speed cuts across the middle of the field, or the vertical threats, because that's a part of his game where he offers a really great dynamic. Whereas I think Pat Bryant, I think he'll be the butter knife that spreads the butter, I think, for this offense here, because I think he's so polished as a route runner inside. He's got the size, the physical traits. Obviously, he's a great at catching the football. Like, this is one thing that stood out to me about tape. Like, he had some bad passes thrown his way, whether it be due to wind, pressure on the quarterback, but he body adjusts relatively well. He's very good at that, very sure-handed. That's a dynamic that I think is going to be very present inside of this offense. So I agree with Lou. That's not really like a bold take, Lou. I like it. I think it's something that we absolutely will see this upcoming season here for Denver. And this kind of transitions here offensively. It segues into something we teased at the NFL schedule release. We get a question: what games will we see some of the Broncos rookies maybe go off a little bit or kind of just break out? Look, it would be easy to say, okay, hey, week 1 against the Tennessee Titans, like, these guys are all going to explode. Let's maybe look at it through a different lens. Like, hey, there's a learning curve in the NFL. Let's start off. We're going to focus on the offensive side in today's episode. Let's focus on RJ Harvey here. For me, I got week 2 against the Indianapolis Colts for RJ Harvey, really kind of seeing his really big game to start off early on in the year. They were a really bad run defense last year. We'll see where, the improvements were made. We'll see what that's like, especially being on the road. But I got RJ in that game. And I actually have Pat Bryant. Like, it would be easy for me to once again go out and say, hey, Pat Bryant, week 1 against the Tennessee Titans, he's going to go off. Week 2 against the Colts, going to go off. Week 3 against the Chargers, he's going to go off. I mean, you'd like to see him go off in AFC West divisional games here. But I got a Monday Night Football matchup in week 4 against the Cincinnati Bengals. I kind of have that as the game where I like Pat Bryant really shoulders the load and comes up with some big plays that puts the Broncos in a position, I'd say, to compete or maybe to win games, right? If you know me, I'm not big into predicting who's going to win or giving, I always just like to let the games play out, because I feel like if I predict it, I'll jinx it. I don't want to do that to Broncos Country. So those are my thoughts there. I'm curious for yours, Broncos Country. Make sure you share yours as well here on today's episode of the show. Obviously, your thoughts on Lou's take as to Pat Bryant becoming a go-to option for Bo Nix right behind Courtland Sutton in key situations. I went through my reasoning. Curious for yours. And also, which games do you think RJ Harvey, Pat Bryant will have their breakout games this upcoming season? Make sure you let us know here on today's episode, Locked on Broncos. We're not done yet, Broncos Country. We still got a lot to break down on today's episode of the show. We got a couple more of your takes, including the Broncos going on the road at the Philadelphia Eagles, at the Kansas City Chiefs, and coming away victorious with a winning record. We'll dive deep into that and much more on today's episode of the show. Broncos Country, today's episode of the show was brought to you by our friends over there at the Gametime app. And there's nothing like the NBA playoffs, the intensity, the buzzer beaters, fans losing their minds, game 7s. It's the kind of atmosphere that you must experience live in this year's matchups. They're already delivering. So if you want in, Gametime makes it fast and easy to get seats, even for the biggest playoff games, and prices on the app. They actually drop closer to tip-off, and with killer last-minute deals, panoramic seat views, and no surprise fees, Gametime is a total game changer. And the NFL schedule release also just dropped. And you better believe I'm already looking at the fall schedule and picking which games I'm going to hit. I'm going to be at every game. But what game are you going to go to, Broncos Country? Well, you'll find great seats for as low as $100 thanks to exclusive discounts. And with the Gametime guarantee, your tickets are 100% authentic, will arrive on time, and you'll always get the best price with fees included. So what you see is what you pay. And if you've never used Gametime to grab NFL seats, now's the time. It's seriously a game day upgrade. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. The Broncos 2025 schedule has been released. And look, Denver's going to have some tough games, but members of Broncos Country believe that they're going to become road warriors and have an impressive record and beat two teams that were in the Super Bowl last year on the road. We'll dive deep into your takes here on today's episode. Locked On Broncos. I want to say thank you once again to everyone in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen as always, so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team. Just a little bit an update. If you're a brand new viewer or listener of the show, I cover the Broncos daily in person in Dove Valley, every practice, every home game, some away games. You get all that coverage here, Locked On Broncos. Myself, Sayre Bedinger, who will rejoin us next week as he gets back from Disney World. We bring you the best Broncos podcast out there because the dynamic can't be matched. No fluff, short, sweet, to the point. That's what you get here. That's our promise to you every single day, all year long. With that said, let's continue on with your takes. Broncos Country always sends in some good takes here. And this one I definitely felt like was interesting. It is a bold take. And if it happened, I tell you what, the narrative on the Denver Broncos would shift entirely, right? Let's go to Joey Dively. He sent in his take here. He said the Broncos, they will go 13-4 this upcoming season, and they will beat the Philadelphia Eagles on the road, week 5, and the Kansas City Chiefs at Arrowhead on Christmas Day. Now, I could tell you this. If the Broncos somehow did that, look, 13-4, that's impressive. Denver's got a tough schedule. I don't know about 13 wins. That would be incredible. I've got them at 11 wins. That's my 11-12. That's kind of my win total projection for them if everything goes according to plan. 13, man, that would be icing on the cake. I'd be a very excited person. I mean, it'd be great news for all of us at the podcast. Broncos Country would be in the best mood we've ever seen them be if that were the case, because there's relevancy, you know. But I think what would really cement this is, could you imagine the Broncos getting off to a hot start here early on in the season, right? Okay, you open up at home against the Tennessee Titans, and, you know, they got a tough defense. They got Jeffrey Simmons. They got some guys, former Bronco Draymond Jones, L'Jarius Sneed. Like, that defensive unit is going to be pretty solid for Tennessee, but Cam Ward's got to face the Broncos defense, right? So let's say, hypothetically, Denver starts off 1-0. Week 2, you go on the road at the Indianapolis Colts. We don't know who the heck their quarterback is going to be at that point. Who's going to be starting? Is going to be Daniel Jones, Anthony Richardson. We know that the Colts have really good wide receivers. They've added, obviously, Tyler Warren into the mix at the tight end position. So they got a dynamic tight end. That's obviously going to be a difference maker for them. And then obviously you have Jonathan Taylor, you know, very good running back, despite the mishap that he had last year at the half-yard line in the Mile High City, which helped the Denver Broncos. Thank you so much, Indianapolis, for that. And then obviously week 3, you got to face the Los Angeles Chargers on the road. Justin Herbert, you got swept by them last year. AFC West game, that's going to be tough. They've added Najee Harris, Omarion Hampton at running back. You got Ladd McConkey, who was a problem for the Broncos last year. Okay, and they got Tyler Conklin at tight end. Mike Williams they brought back. So, I mean, solid team there in Los Angeles, right? But let's say Denver starts off 3-0, and then you have that Monday night game against Joe Burrow and the Cincinnati Bengals. Let's say Denver wins that game, starts off 4-0. Could you imagine the narratives that would be in place if the Broncos in week 5 go on the road at the Philadelphia Eagles, 11 a.m. Mountain Time kickoff, and they beat the Philadelphia Eagles? Saquon Barkley, Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, Dallas Goedert. I mean, this is a team, they're loaded. The biggest offensive line in the NFL, which I think, we saw the Broncos struggled a little bit against the Buffalo Bills O-line in the playoffs last year. They had good size there, but Philly's O-line is massive. The Broncos go on the road and win that game, and let's say they're 5-0 at that point. The narratives are going to be insane. But also, I think that comes with a lot of pressure, right? You start off 5-0, all eyes are on you the rest of the way. You're going to be getting more national media attention on a week-to-week basis, on a day-to-day basis, in terms of going into every matchup, going into every game, especially when you get your Week 12 bye. You've got some tough matchups then and there. I mean, you might get some all eyes on you type of emphasis, because that Week 11 game, you play the Kansas City Chiefs. So let's just say like Denver's got a winning record at that juncture here to kind of go into what obviously Joey said here about 13-4. I'm curious to see what games come in as a loss on that, Joey. If you want to send that in, that'd be great clarity there. But the Broncos, that would just change the entire narrative of this team. They would be considered, I mean, at this point, people would be talking about them in a light of, hey, this is a legitimate team. You go on the road and you beat that Philadelphia Eagles team, and obviously they have a fantastic defense there. And obviously you're facing former Broncos head coach Vic Fangio, former Broncos defensive backs coach Christian Parker, who's the defensive passing game coordinator over there. I'm very curious about this, but you've got them going on the road to beat the Eagles, Week 5, and then Mahomes and the Chiefs on Christmas Day, which I can see that being very possible. I think that's a little bit more of a favorable matchup for the Broncos right now. And look, I think everything under the microscope, when we're talking about records, wins, losses, it really has to be under best case scenario if everyone stays healthy, right? Because an injury can dethrone you at certain points of the season, depending on what positions get hit. You have to find a way to adjust. So hopefully the Broncos can stay healthy. But Joey, I like the take here on today's episode of the show, my man. Thank you so much for that one. Our next one is going to come in from Denver Trav. He says the Broncos will win the AFC West. I mean, I think that there's a possibility. Like Sayre and I, when we talked about the schedule release and we broke it down in that best case scenario type of analysis, Denver's got an opportunity here. I mean, look, Kansas City, they're still going to be the favorite for the division. You got to knock them off the top before you can take the throne, right? But you're going to have the Chargers gunning for them. You're going to have the Broncos gunning for them. Are the Raiders going to be in a position this year where they surprise people? I mean, I could see it happening. But I'm not banking on that, right? I think that the Raiders will be tough and competitive under Pete Carroll. I think they'll be drastically better than what they were last year. But Denver early on, as we mentioned, 8 of their first 11 games this upcoming season, they are AFC conference matchups. You have to take care of business in those categories specifically for tiebreaker purposes. You don't want to be at the end of the season when you're in those final stretch, where you got, I think, Green Bay, you got Jacksonville, you got the Chiefs, and then you got the Chargers and the Raiders. Think those final 5 games of the season. You don't want to go into any of those matchups in the final 5 games of the year and say like, wow, if Denver would have taken care of business week 2 or week 3 or week 4 in those AFC matchups, then they wouldn't be in this position, where you need to control your own destiny versus hoping you don't have to be in a position where other teams do it. Denver was in that situation last year where obviously they had to win one game in those final stretches, right? Of those final 3 or 4 games in order to make the playoffs. They lost against the Bengals. They lost against the Chargers. And then it's like, oh, now you got to beat the Chiefs. Well, luckily they rested their starters. I always think to myself to this day, I wonder what it would have been like, though. I think Denver could have beaten Kansas City even if they had played Patrick Mahomes and the starters in that Week 18 game. But be in a position to become road warriors, essentially, this upcoming season. You've got 8 road games. 7 of them are going to be played in the U.S. Obviously, you got the London game there. Become road warriors, but more importantly, take care of business at home. The Broncos did that last season, which was an upgrade from what we've seen the last couple of years. You maybe start to get that advantage back here, that altitude advantage that we always talk about. So we'll see where things go here for the Broncos, but Denver Trav says that they're going to win the AFC West. We're curious for your thoughts on this one here, Broncos Country. But we're not done just yet, Denver. We got a lot to break down here still on today's episode of the show. Lost in the schedule release earlier this week, the Broncos, they made several roster moves, some interesting ones at that, as they prepare for OTAs and minicamp. We'll tell you about them and the impact it has on the team here on today's episode, Locked on Broncos. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked on Broncos, we want to say thank you once again to everyone in Broncos Country, all the everydayers out there. Thanks for making the show exactly what it is. We went through your takes on today's episode show, but now we got to get to a little bit of news. Not necessarily big news here for the team, but lost in the shuffle that was the anticipation for the schedule release. You had really that build up till Wednesday night of, are these leaks legit about the schedule, right? And that's why you just had to let things play out here. But in the midst of that, we talked about it last week, and the Broncos held rookie mini camp, and we even said after the show that, hey, expect this week the Broncos to make several roster moves and some changes based on what they've seen from tryout players versus undrafted players, so on and so forth, as Denver really tries to build that 90-man roster, which they're at that right now. But they made several roster moves this week that I felt like we have to talk about. Nothing big that's going to be like, oh, no, that's a shocking decision. But they got some interesting flexibility. I'll dive deeper to that here in a second. So first off, let's go through the players that the Broncos had moved on from this week. They had waived linebacker KJ Cloyd, and this is a player who was a scout team player of the week for them a couple times last season. He was one of those late signings that was added to the practice squad last year. We didn't see that. We didn't know who that guy was, but you go in the locker room. It was the last day. It was like, when the Broncos were cleaning out their lockers, Jonathan Cooper was talking to KJ Cloyd and was like, hey, man, proud of you. You earned this, because he received, essentially an invite, like a futures contract. You sign that really on your last day there, and you have a chance to all right, hey, now you have access to the team facility all offseason. You'll be back initially for mini camp, whatever it may be. KJ Cloyd was one of those guys that earned an invite, obviously, as a futures signing. And Jonathan Cooper had a lot of high praise for him and kind of took him under his wing. So, obviously that dynamic stinks, but it's the business side of the NFL. So KJ Cloyd no longer on the Broncos roster there. They waived cornerback Kendall Bowler as well. I mean, Denver's secondary room right now at corner, it is loaded with a bunch of dudes. So it was going to be hard. And obviously, I think this is a shift here for the Broncos and for Sean Payton, because they have numbers at cornerback. You really have to, that's like the one position when you're trying to formulate your best 90-man roster and you're going to make changes here and there. Usually the position rooms that have the most guys in them, we're looking at cornerback, we're looking at wide receiver, safety. These are positions that are loaded for Denver right now. You'll usually see somebody get cut or released from here that are kind of on the back end of it. So Kendall Bowler released by the Broncos. But an interesting one here at tight end, Thomas Yasmin, who obviously the Broncos had on the practice squad all of last season. He had the international player exemption designation on his roster status there. So he didn't count against the Broncos roster last year. Now, when he was on the practice squad, he didn't count as one of those 16 spots on the practice squad. So, there's value to have that international player designation, but they released Thomas Yasmin. And with that freed up the designation. So the Broncos were awarded that designation for 6th round punter Jeremy Crawshaw. So Crawshaw, who obviously was drafted by Denver, booming leg, he's actually not going to count against the Broncos roster, right? So he's the punter. He's obviously got that job on lock right now because they released Matt Hack a couple of weeks ago. So for him, he's going to be essentially on your 53-man roster, but he will not count against it. So that's playing the roster flexibility game here. Sean Payton's very, very good at that. So you like that dynamic that you're going to have there. It gives you maybe an extra spot at maybe a position you feel like, okay, hey, we need a guy to play special teams, or we really like this guy. We can't risk him going through waivers when we make roster cuts after that third preseason game against the New Orleans Saints. So we'll see where things are at with that. And then they released nose tackle Christian Dowell. But in return, you make 4 roster moves like that, you have to bring up 4 players. And that's exactly what the Broncos did. And they signed tight end Cole Fotheringham. He was one of the pro tryout players here for the Broncos this past week at rookie minicamp. And we got a chance to see him, obviously a former Utah tight end. So once again, Denver's got 2 tight ends at Utah. Thomas Yasmin was one, but they released him. But they got Caleb Lohner, and now they've got obviously Fotheringham, who, has got some NFL experience. He's only played really in 1 game. I think he's got 1 career catch essentially, but I think he's a 3-year player. A veteran guy. I'd say they brought him in more so as a camp body, blocking ability, maybe to bring onto the practice squad at some point here. But the tight end room is going to have a very interesting kind of shakeout to it, with obviously Caleb Lohner getting a 4-year deal. You still have Adam Troutman on the final year of his deal with the Broncos, and then Evan Ingram as that joker move around piece. You still have Nate Adkins and Lucas Kroll in the mix. So competition probably here really for Lucas Kroll maybe Nate Adkins, with Fotheringham there. I'm interested to see how that's going to shake out for training camp. So they signed him to a deal, but then they also signed undrafted free agent tryout player Jordan Turner, inside linebacker out of Michigan State. And he was one of the players that I had initially talked about when we did our recap episode following Broncos rookie minicamp last Saturday. I said, hey, this is one guy that stood out to me. Inside linebacker, you can tell he's rangy, moves well laterally side to side, gets good depth on his drop backs into coverage. And I would just say the one thing, too, the advantage, and this was something that was also reported, was he picked up the playbook relatively quickly in terms of just being a tryout player. He took command of that defensive huddle. That's something that stood out. So now you add, a linebacker who's 6'1", 6'2", athletic, can move well to the mix here for some competition. I'd say more so it kind of puts Lavelle Bailey in another competition this upcoming year, and that would be Jordan Turner. So keep an eye on him as we prepare for training camp, as we also prepare for the preseason. And then they brought back long snapper Zach Triner, who initially the Friday of rookie minicamp last week, they released him and veteran Matt Hack to free up some roster spots. They brought Triner back because you had, I think, maybe that designation where Crawshaw doesn't count against your roster. So now you can bring Triner back in that place because of the injury to Mitchell Fraboni, who obviously underwent a back procedure this offseason. He's making good progress. He should be ready to go for training camp, but you need a guy for obviously OTAs, mandatory mini camp. So we'll continue to monitor this, but he obviously was brought back into the mix. And then they brought in another guy. Obviously, they signed another tryout player from this past week, and that is a wide receiver, Kyrie White, wide receiver out of Utah State. And I would say, when we're at rookie minicamp, we're watching all the wide receivers. There's a ton of them. We're watching, and I'm trying to figure out, I'm like, all right, who is this guy that is just running crisp routes? Like, not only a good route runner, but we're talking about running with speed and efficiency, just, giving high effort. And, he's got long curly hair. And I was trying to figure out because, we're a little bit of ways away at times. We couldn't see who it was. And we saw his number. Like, all right, Kyrie White. He impressed enough to obviously earn an invite to Broncos minicamp and potentially here for training camp. And that's the process here, right? He made it through the hurdle of being a tryout player. And then you make it to, okay, you're going to get an invite to minicamp and OTAs. You got to continue to impress in those two categories right there in order to get that solidified invite to training camp, because the roster could still change even as OTAs on go. They could say, all right, we're not getting enough out of this. We're going to release this guy. We're going to bring back maybe a guy that we had circled on our scouting report here, who was with us in tryouts. That's one thing that happens in these situations is that, okay, when you try out for a team, you already have a database of knowledge and information about, what are you going to get from this player? And teams keep that in mind really all throughout the entire season. It's not just, all right, hey, we just need someone through the summer. It's in the preseason. It's in the regular season. When there's an injury or there's someone who gets poached off the practice squad, the Broncos will go through and say, is this guy on anyone's roster right now? If not, they'll bring him in, they'll try him out again, and then they'll sign the guy to the practice squad. So some of these guys didn't get the opportunity to make it to OTAs and minicamp, but that doesn't mean that their journey is essentially over. They have a chance. But Kyrie White, speedster out of Utah State, I also think will factor into the return game here. He'll get some reps in the kick return, punt return game here for the Broncos and OTAs and minicamp. But the one thing that you do like is that speed. I mean, this is a guy who can catch a dig route at about 8 or 9 yards, and then he can just do damage the rest of the way. If you go pull up his highlights at Utah State, you'll see that he stood out in a big way, a real legit speedster here. And I think also this, maybe not going to impact the wide receiver room in any way, shape, or form. But I think when you see a guy with that type of speed, the one thing I look at as a former coach, I think to myself, all right, I want to see what this guy can do as a gunner on punt or on kickoff. Can this guy get downfield and go cause and create havoc? Those are the things I always ask myself, and I'm sure that's where the Broncos are going to give a look at him, because he can return for you, as I mentioned, in the punt and the kick return game. But he can also, I think, play gunner. He can also play one of the outside guys on kickoff that runs downfield. So you immediately have potential as a core 4 special teams player. That is where you can make the roster. That's what Devin Key did himself to make the roster. He became a core 4 specialist. Now you have some young guys, some more competition added to the mix. It's only going to make things better here for the Denver Broncos. But with that said, Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's episode show. Thank you so much for tuning in, making us your first listen, however you choose to do so. Sayre Bedinger, myself, will be back with you on Monday for a brand new episode of the show where we're going to dive into the Broncos as they go into OTAs and minicamp. Are there still any glaring needs? Are there any questions that we have that are unanswered about this team? Well, we'll break that down and much more on Monday's episode, Locked On Broncos. Enjoy your weekend, Broncos Country.